I'm Steve Beck with the LSU Office of Research and Economic Development, and we're excited to bring you tonight's program featuring research by LSU Ag Center's School of Renewable and Natural Resources faculty and Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries staff on the native Louisiana Eastern Wild Turkey. Live closed captioning for this event is available. Click on the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen, and you should be able to see it. Despite our physical distance, our goal is to build a strong, informed community by providing access to reliable information, new ideas, and cutting-edge research, scholarship, and creativity from faculty experts and researchers in fields across the university. Tonight's event is brought to you in partnership with local public radio station WRKF. WRKF will be giving away one stainless steel NPR Science Friday beverage tumbler to one lucky audience member tonight. To enter the drawing, click on the link in the chat box and fill out the Google form with your contact information. At the end of tonight's broadcast, we'll reveal the winner. Also, please be aware that this online event is being recorded and it will be available with a transcription from the LSU research website within the next few days. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's program and speakers who will present some of their research on the native Louisiana Eastern Wild Turkey population, which is experiencing a steady decline. Dr. Bret Collier is a wildlife ecologist who primarily studies mammal and bird populations in game species such as wild turkeys. He's an associate professor in the LSU Ag Center's School of Renewable Natural Resources. He applies spatial modeling as well as statistical and computational ecology in his research. Dr. Cody Cedotal has worked with the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, or LDWF, for 22 years and has served as the resident small game and wild turkey program manager since October 2015. Prior to his current position, he worked in the LDWF forestry program, assisting private landowners as a forest stewardship program biologist, and served as farm bill coordinator for LDWF. As resident small game and wild turkey program manager, he is responsible for monitoring and managing populations of squirrels, rabbits, quails, and turkey in Louisiana. After their presentation, we'll have a moderated question and answer session. To participate, please use the Q&A button to enter your question. We will be monitoring that section and relaying them to our panelists. Now, I'll turn it over to Dr. Collier.
Thank you, Stephen. I hope everyone is doing well this evening. I was very excited whenever I was contacted about a year ago for the opportunity to come and do a science cafe. I was actually looking forward to, I think, being at the varsity and seeing everyone's face, but I hope that this is an appropriate substitute given the times. And I look forward to visiting with you all and with Cody tonight and talking a little bit about the wild turkey in Louisiana and more generally across the United States. So it's always funny about this time of year whenever a person's a turkey biologist, because there's never more attention put on the species that you study than whenever you approach Thanksgiving. But most of the time, or generally kind of speaking, around this time of year, everyone's thinking about turkeys, but they're thinking about turkeys in the context of pilgrims and of Thanksgiving, and they might be thinking about butterballs and what one they're going to pick up at the local grocery store. And there's usually some conversation about whether or not there's going to be a presidential pardon in the mix for a specific turkey. So it's exciting to come in here and actually talk a little bit about the species that I basically spent a career studying, and that Cody, who's my colleague and friend here in Louisiana, has the responsibility of managing for the state. So I'm hoping that we can provide a little bit of information, provide a little bit of history, and hopefully create some discussion and some good questions. So I kind of wanted to start out with the fact that whenever people think of turkeys, they generally don't think of the two individuals that are here on the screen. They typically think of the individuals that you see at a farm or in a barnyard, or at a petting zoo, where, you can take your kids. And what I kind of wanted to point out was just a real quick kind of morphology lesson was the individual in the back is a male wild turkey. You can see that he's significantly larger than the individual in the front, which is a female. He's currently courting that female, so he's kind of showing off. He's got his tail feathers fanned out, showing her how big he is. He's got the feathers on his back puffed up. His chest is puffed out. You'll notice on the front he has a beard. Those are fibrous feathers, but they look like hair, and they basically come out of a little nodule on the chest. You also notice that his head is red, white, and blue. And if you look close, you can see that he has a fleshy appendage kind of hanging off the front, above his beak. That's called a snood. A very large, beautiful bird. Many of you probably heard that turkeys gobble. They make a whole host of sounds, but the gobble is probably the most generally recognized. And then you'll notice that the smaller individual in the front's a female. The female is fairly drab. Significantly smaller. Her feathers don't have the kind of iridescence that most people equate with a male wild turkey. Her head doesn't have the same type of coloration. Her neck feathers don't go up nearly as high. And she's generally just a little bit browner and, just a more drab. And the reason for that is that male turkeys display to attract females. And it makes sense for them to be very noticeable and very easily seen, very vocal. They want to get attention. Females, on the other hand, turkeys are what's called a ground nesting species, and they nest on the ground. They scrape out small indentions on the ground where they lay their eggs. And it's useful for a female wild turkey to not be noticeable and not be seen or anything like that. So they're kind of being a sexual difference in size and coloration. I wanted to kind of bring it up just because most people don't ever get to see typically a wild turkey unless it's running across the road in front of them. And it's fun to talk about turkeys about this kind of year. And there's a kind of a little history behind them that goes all the way back to the kind of start of our country. There's a historic rumor that Benjamin Franklin wanted the wild turkey to be the national bird. And that rumor, unfortunately, is untrue, although for a turkey biologist, that'd be fantastic. What actually had happened is he had written a letter to his sister, I believe, where he called the wild turkey a bird of courage. And he commented on the fact that a wild turkey will, charge people in the barnyard and try and keep them out of their area. And then he criticized the bald eagle, which is our current national bird, criticized the bald eagle as being a sneak and a carrion eater and that kind of thing. So even though the wild turkey is not our national bird and Benjamin Franklin didn't recommend it, there's some interesting kind of history about the wild turkey that I wanted to bring out. We've had a long history of wild turkeys in the United States. Colonial times, wild turkeys were widespread. In the United States, we are in North America. So think Canada, the United States, and Mexico down to the Yucatan and some of Central America all work in there. There's two species of turkeys. There's the Meleagris gallopavo, which is the species that predominates the United States. And then there's the ocellated wild turkey, the Meleagris ocellata, which is only found in the Yucatan Peninsula and some in Central America, in a few locations. But there are, in the United States, and in that area, we actually have 6 subspecies once you kind of include Mexico. You've got the eastern, which is the wild turkey that's predominantly east of the Mississippi River, which is generally the one that Cody and I deal with most often. You have the Osceola, which is the species that's found in southern Florida. You have the Rio, or the Rio Grande. Yes, thank you. The Rio Grande. So the eastern would be the blue. The Osceola would be the yellow. You have the Rio Grande, which would be the red seen there. You have the Merriams, which is the purple. And these guys, Merriams, are typically more affiliated with mountainous regions. And then you have the Goulds, which is the yellow kind of down into Mexico. Now I said 6, and that's only 5. There's a 6th. It's called the Mexican turkey, and we think it's extinct, although there have been some photographs that have shown up over the last couple of years that people are unsure of the true genetic lineage in fairly rural areas of Mexico. So, but with current knowledge is that we think that it's extinct. So those are generally our 6 species, and we can leave this map up here for a little bit. So this is kind of the current turkey range. Historically, we estimate that there were around 10 million turkeys in the United States. And that number is a pretty rough estimate, and it's fairly broad. But that was the best we had in kind of colonial times. The problem is that by the 1920s and the 1930s, due to market hunting in the 1800s, where individuals would go out west or anywhere in the United States and basically harvest turkeys and then send them back for food to the East Coast, where the populations of people were, not dissimilar to bison or a great number of other species. When combined with large-scale habitat loss due to changes in agricultural practices, we saw pretty significant declines in wild turkey populations across the United States. And when I mean significant, I mean 90% plus, going from 10 million birds during colonial times to less than 200,000 in the United States by the 1920s to 1930s. And we entered about that period, the early point of the restoration. And the original restoration for wild turkeys was actually attempted using pen-reared birds. It started in 1929 in Virginia, if I'm not mistaken. And there was about 40 years, or 30 or 40 years from the late 20s to about 1960, where we tried to restore turkeys via the use of pen-reared birds. And it was pretty unsuccessful. But then in 1951, biologists in South Carolina kind of initiated the use of the cannon or the rocket net that could shoot a net over turkeys to catch them, over wild turkeys. And we started a different phase of restoration, where instead of growing turkeys in a pen and releasing them into the wild, we started catching wild turkeys in areas that still had turkeys, the 200,000 or so, and moving them to new locations. And over about 30 years, we have restored from about the 1960s to about the 1990s. We restored the wild turkey, and we meaning folks like Cody, your state wildlife agencies, non-governmental organizations like the National Wild Turkey Federation, all working in concert, restored the wild turkey across the United States. And it is one of the kind of greatest success stories for translocation and restoration that exists in the United States, for taking a native species that was almost extirpated across its range and then restoring it across its range again. It's one of our greatest success stories as a field of wildlife conservation. Currently, we estimate that there's somewhere between about 5.5 and 6 million turkeys today. And I'm going to turn over to Cody for a second, and he's going to talk about kind of the history of turkeys in Louisiana and kind of the status of turkeys in Louisiana right now. So Cody, take it away.
Thank you, Bret. And that was a real good overview of kind of the national restocking effort that took place. And Louisiana was no different than many other states. Beginning in about the 1960s, we started heavily trying to restock wild turkeys. Prior to that, we too had tried some pen release birds to no avail. But once those techniques with cannon nets and rocket nets were kind of initiated, we were able to also move birds around, move wild birds from one area to another. We also actually got birds from other states and brought them to our state. They came from as far away as South Carolina, gave us quite a few birds at the time, but for the most part, we found the most success with moving our local birds, our birds that were closest to the area that we were interested in restocking, and whether that be, from a couple of parishes over or from across the state. So just in all total in Louisiana, since the 60s, we've restocked or translocated approximately 4,000 turkeys. The number is right around 3,900 and some change. Like I said, it started in the 1960s, and it went all the way through. The last birds we translocated were actually pretty recently here in 2016. We had a little small effort for an area that was void of some turkeys and had suitable habitat up in Caddo Parish in the northwest part of our state. So that's the critical part, as Bret mentioned, was habitat loss was a big problem with them. Also at the turn of the century, when a lot of these areas were transitioned over to ag land, and loss of habitat was really key then. That's also key today. So we don't ever bring turkeys to an area that does not have suitable habitat to where we think they can do well and expand their population. Otherwise, that'd be pretty irresponsible of us. So for the most part, we feel like we have restocked the entire state to the level as needed in all the suitable habitats that we have. That doesn't mean turkeys are doing great in every part of the state. We're experiencing some declines in our turkey populations, especially along the Mississippi River. Those areas that have been impacted by flooding most frequently here in the last 10 years. We've seen some significant population declines and things of that nature, but it's, external factors are contributing to that. We've tried to make some regulation changes and offset some of these things that are happening throughout the state. But, we're not alone in seeing some population declines, and I'm sure Bret's going to touch on it a little bit later on with some other southeastern states, what they're seeing as well, and what our research is showing us, and what we're trying to do moving forward, for conservation of this beautiful bird. So it's kind of my little summary. If anybody has any questions, hit them up in the chat, and we'll kind of move on from here, I guess. Thanks, Bret.
Yeah, no problem, Cody. Thank you. And Cody's one of the most knowledgeable people about turkeys in the state of Louisiana. So I hope that you all ask some good questions, because we don't get an opportunity to have the state turkey biologist and I suppose the turkey researchers sitting here at the same time. I suppose that what I wanted to mention with Cody here, and we may play off of each other a little bit, is turkey we're dealing with across the United States right now. We've seen kind of broad scale wild turkey declines. Some areas, as Cody mentioned, are worse than others, and I'm going to focus strictly on some of the stuff we see in Louisiana right now. And more recently, I'm going to talk about some of the more recent events that have had moderate impacts. Everyone knows that the Morganza Spillway was opened, in 2011, if I'm not mistaken, and we had 20 feet of water, basically a wall of water, moved down the Café Basin, and we actually had turkeys that we were tracking out there during that time period, and the birds have been very slow to recover. Because turkeys, even though people tend to think that turkeys have big nests with lots of eggs, and I think I've got a slide of a turkey nest, if we could maybe transition over to that. I think it'll be my last slide for everybody, which is really weird for a faculty member to say, because normally I got 80 slides and 20 in reserve. But most people, when they think about turkey nest, they think about something that looks like this. It's got a whole bunch of eggs that are hatched, and that lots of turkeys get produced every year. What we know about wild turkeys is that only about 30% of our nests that get put on the landscape are successful every year, and only about 5% to 10% of those successful nests actually have their poults, their little chicks, grow up. So our problem that we are running into right now is declines in reproduction. And that's been something that a wide variety of researchers, not just myself, but folks at the University of Georgia, the University of Tennessee, the University of Maine, the North Carolina State University, the University of Illinois, the Michigan State University, are all jointly discussing and looking at potential issues that are inhibiting reproduction. But that's not a lot of fun to talk about, but that's what we're focused on. We've been really fortunate over the last decade in that technology has caught up with our needs for science, in that whenever Cody and I started this, we would put a tracker on a bird, a tag. I actually have one here that looks like this. And we would have to send a graduate student, if I can get it to stay here, send a graduate student out to track birds around and follow them every day. And with the advent of some of these technological changes that we've had, so much that most of you have an iPhone, just like me, with the advent of that, we've actually got to the point where we can put a tag on a turkey that collects its spatial location every hour of the day, all day, every day. And what that's done is that's opened up kind of our knowledge base to these birds, and has allowed us to ask a host of new, interesting and exciting questions about their behavioral ecology and how they move through different vegetative communities on the landscape. And it's allowed us to experiment as well with these birds. Turkeys are a early successional habitat species, and they exist in a landscape where they like areas that have been burned a couple of years prior, that has, low, turkeys like to see is the easiest way to explain it. And if they can't see through it or see over it, they won't go into it. So areas that they can see through and go into are typically early successional type of habitats that have lots of bugs, lots of good forage, lots of places for them to hide from predators. And the use of technology, when combined with the on-the-ground management stuff that Cody and I work so hard on, has really allowed us to experiment and manipulate these birds in a natural landscape to see what we can do to increase production and create more successful nests of kind of like this. Cody, did I miss anything there?
No, Bret, you covered it quite thoroughly. I mean, the advent of this technology utilizing GPS has really made us be able to look at things we never would have been able to see in the past, especially with fine scale movement data and actual timing of nesting and exact locations and that sort of thing, some habitat characteristics related to that.
Yeah. And I'll say this while Cody's on her, we're very opportunistic in that we had a natural experiment occur this year at one of our study sites. When Hurricane Laura tracked through Lake Charles, it actually went through the Kisatchie National Forest area, which has been a long-term research site for the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, the wildlife program, and myself here at LSU in collaboration. And we're currently evaluating what the potential impacts are going to be to the loss of timber and the change in vegetative structure kind of in that area. So there's a ton of really interesting questions, and anyone who's ever talked to me about turkeys knows that I can talk about turkeys for hours on end without a break and not lose my breath. But I'm sure there's going to be some questions from the audience here, but I'll generally kind of wrap up with the turkey talk is that it's an exciting time to be a turkey biologist at LSU, getting to work with Cody and with the LSU Ag Center and be engaged with so many stakeholders, people who enjoy turkeys for, recreational pursuits, for going out and doing birding and observation, and people just enjoy seeing them in the forest. So I guess I kind of want to end before we go to Stephen and some questions is that, Cody and mine's goal is to collaboratively work to inform, educate, and do the best available science on the species so that he can assist landowners with, land management activities that better serve to maintain habitat on private lands, because even in a state like Louisiana with so much public land available, most of our turkeys exist on a private land matrix. So that's why Cody and I have got this really solid relationship on collecting information and getting it applied across the state. And Cody, do you have anything you want to add to that before I think Steve will jump back in there and we'll take some questions for a little bit?
Yeah, I just want to make mention of the fact that, when you look at our overall harvest for the state of Louisiana, we don't rank among, too many of the highest states in terms of harvest. There are states like Alabama and even our neighboring state, Mississippi, that harvest a heck of a lot more turkeys than we do. But one thing we've been really active with over the years is even though we aren't, necessarily a big out-of-state draw for non-resident hunters to come find birds here, we try to stay on top of, the latest and greatest research as best we can. And LSU has been a great partner, and Bret has been a great partner. And those that were before him, Dr. Chamberlain was here for LSU for a time. We've always partnered and done some really good work on some of our wildlife management areas and study sites throughout the state. And a lot of good turkey research has come from Louisiana, and that's been in part due to the good relationships we've had with these researchers and their willingness to work with us as well. And which is not easy at times, as with any kind of relationship, but we try to move forward and put out the best information we can to advance our knowledge on these birds.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. This has really been a provocative discussion, because we have a lot of questions. We have a lot. So I'm just going to jump right in and pick a few, and let's see what we can come up with. So early on, someone had noticed on the map that you had of the various species that there was a small pocket of easterns that were living in, or that were found in Washington State. I also noticed that in California, it looked like there were some Rio Grande turkeys that were there. Is that because of the collocation efforts or translocation efforts that were underway, or is there some other reason, some other connection that we're not aware of?
Okay, so as a general rule, people have attempted restoration of a lot of species in different places historically. Some species are generally a little bit, sorry, I want to get my camera center. Some species are generally a little bit more amenable to being picked up and moved long distances and dropped out, and a little bit more adaptable. The Rio Grande subspecies has been determined to be probably the most adaptable of our subspecies to a wide variety of conditions. They're typically considered kind of a semi-arid bird, primarily found in Texas, areas that maybe had, very moderate to low rainfall, not kind of,
right.
More variability year to year. And your Rio Grandes they've been found that they're very robust to these different kind of habitat types. So we've kind of initially stuck them in various places. The small eastern pocket in Washington was a early restoration, if I remember, that just kind of hung on. But for the most part, kind of the dividing line for eastern Rios, we say it's the Mississippi River. You'll get some bleed over into Kansas and Nebraska, where you get into the foothills. And there's a little green line on that map. And that's where your Rio Grandes and your easterns actually create a hybrid, because they'll interbreed.
I saw that on the
Yeah.
I saw that on the map. Yeah.
And actually, they have a funny name. A lot of people like to call them super turkeys. I'm unclear that they're super about anything other than being genetically half and half. But we tend to find that from a restoration perspective, our eastern birds do really good east of the Mississippi and in that kind of general corridor. And then our Rio Grandes do pretty good west of the Mississippi. But you'll also notice that there's a lot of pockets on the western half of the United States, but the eastern half of the United States is very consistent. So we don't get as much consistency, as much spread in the semi-arid regions as we do in the kind of more static regions that are, more environmentally consistent in the eastern United States. I hope I answered that question okay.
No, I think actually it did. And I'm from California originally, and there's a lot of microclimate situations where you have areas that are very arid right next to areas that are less so. And so I could understand that, but that certainly explains that. We've had several questions talking about turkey habitat. what are the kinds of turkey habitat? What are the kinds of habitat that turkeys really like? What are the things that you look for in a quality turkey habitat? What kinds of conditions would disqualify a natural turkey habitat? So maybe I'll throw that out to Cody.
Yeah, thank you. Here in Louisiana and across the Southeast, turkeys use a combination of different forest types and habitat types, if you will. Sometimes a good combination will include some hardwood stands or hardwood bottoms for a hard mass component. They typically depend on that in the wintertime, to as overwintering habitat. In the spring, they typically transition to more of an upland type of habitat, pine uplands. Sometimes there are some hardwood uplands depending on where you are and in the state and in other states. But some of the things that are most important is to basically have some type of active management program where you're manipulating the forest to encourage tree fall gaps, whatever you can to manage the understory vegetation. You don't want your forest clean of vegetation with anything but leaves. You want a good mixture of scattered thickets and areas that turkeys can easily move through that are open. So you want more of a managed understory. And it's kind of think of it in the middle between, walking away from a place and looking out through a stand of trees that have nothing but leaves on the ground. That's not necessarily ideal. And the flip side of that is not either. When you harvest an area completely and it comes back in an entire dense vegetation and thicket across that given property, that's not good as well. So you want kind of a combination of that throughout your property or throughout your area. Some of the things we look for, I'm assuming they're asking in terms of translocation, reintroduction, type of stuff. We look for large areas of contiguous forest, as unfragmented as possible to bring birds to and give us the best chance. And most of the time, our minimum area for that would be, probably looking at 4,000 to 5,000 acres of that in one unit. Doesn't have to be completely contiguous, but it a turkey needs to be able to walk from the north end to the south end with minimal exposure across vast agriculture areas. That doesn't have to all be under one ownership. We've worked with landowners before and developed cooperatives, and as long as all the landowners are on board and are willing to conduct some beneficial habitat management, then we kind of try to work with those folks. In the end, we're just looking for a place a turkey can thrive and do well. And I hope I've answered a little bit of that. And it's, kind of depending on where you are in the state, some of the habitats can look a little different, but in general, that's kind of what they look for. A good mixture of open areas and dense areas with managed understories. One thing I want to mention, a couple of the management activities that are most common for managing habitat. Sometimes people think food plots or things like that, and those can be good and good supplemental type of management, but really the most bang for your buck and cost effective way to manage your habitats is through frequent forest management, select timber harvest and prescribed fire, when you're in the uplands. It can't be overlooked. It's the probably most cost effective, beneficial tool we have to manage turkey habitat. So with that, I hope I kind of covered that.
No, absolutely. Here's a slightly different question. It's come in a variety of questions here. What are the natural predators for turkeys in Louisiana? We've had a couple of specific questions about feral hogs, but I would imagine that in addition to those, that there might be other predators that would affect turkey populations. Dr. Collier, what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. So, and whoever asked that question, and I don't know if it's okay to throw this out there, but obviously I'm a state employee. Cody is a state employee. Our email addresses are readily available. And if someone wants to follow up later, I'm more than happy to send information, literature, and actual numbers to you if I don't happen to answer your question exactly tonight, because that's what we do. So what are the predators of wild turkey? Well, it depends upon what type of time of year we're talking about. The feral hog question is probably tied specific to nesting. It's interesting. Feral hogs are not a huge turkey nest predator. Turkeys aren't predated on by feral hogs for any amount. You occasionally see a picture online of a feral hog carrying a turkey carcass around or something like that, but feral hogs, actually, to the opposite degree, turkeys will defend their nest against feral hogs. We have photographs of them, fighting off feral hogs or not moving off of their nest because they don't view feral hogs as a predator. Typically, feral hogs or feral pigs come into the equation when something else has already predated either the nest or the hen. So primary predators of wild turkey hens, and they're primarily predated when they're sitting on the nest, are owls. Bobcats are probably the primary two. Coyotes will get a few. And then there's maybe a couple of others that'll, occasionally a dog will get something or that kind of thing. But those are our big kind of predators of females, of nesting females. Nothing eats males. They'll eat it if they can catch them, but males don't die. Most males die by harvest. They don't die naturally. And we have tons of telemetry data that shows that. So really what we're talking about is what affects females when they're nesting and eggs. Everything likes to eat eggs. Probably our number one predator of turkey eggs is rat snakes or snakes of some guild, but the people would typically call them rat snakes. Coach whips, rat snakes, some of the gar snakes, that kind of thing. They will decimate turkey nests. We catch them all the time at turkey nests. But from people typically think about mammals. Bobcats will predate turkey nests, raccoons, possums, coyotes. I'm sure that a bear would eat a turkey nest if it found one. Feral hogs will eat eggs if they find them, but that's typically after the fact. Most of these events where nests get predated is after the female has already been depredated on the nest. We do occasionally see some weird ones. Here's a list. Roadrunners, blue jays, corvids will, so that would be your crows and ravens. Corvids will definitely predate turkey nests if they can get in there when the female is away. Sometimes hawks, maybe not so much for easterns, but for Rio Grandes, the crested caracara will actually take eggs out of a nest if a female is not there. Let me see, I got blue jays, I got squirrels, chipmunks. We've had chipmunks break open eggs before. So it's basically like kind of, a little food, pile out there that about anything that wants to jump on it can get. Cody, did I miss anything in there? I'm sure I did. So.
Well, I mean, just some other mammals that are pretty hard on the skunks. They fall in that class with raccoons and whatnot. And there's some of the odd things you see. You sent me that picture of a deer eating an egg. Mm-hmm. I was pretty appropriate because I'm really not a deer guy, but so oddball stuff like that. But the take home in terms of I saw there was a specific question to how do feral hogs affect turkeys. As Bret said, we kind of discovered they're more opportunistic than people tend to think. They don't huddle up in the morning, break the huddle, and go out looking for turkey nests. They're looking for anything there is to eat, period. And they happen upon a nest where all the eggs have been broken by a raccoon. They're going to finish that off, per se, scrap that up. So, and that's evidence we typically see in the woods. But when you put a camera on the nest, you saw what actually got it. But as far as feral hogs impacts, I don't really about them as much in terms of nesting impacts as it is for a competition for resource throughout their annual cycle. Just like with white-tailed deer or any of our native wildlife for that matter, squirrels, when you get in some of our hardwood bottom areas and you have a good mast year and there's a lot of mast on the ground and you think things are looking up, reproduction is going to be high, body conditions are going to be good. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden you come into that pretty hardwood bottom the next week or the next month and there's nothing but hog rooting and not an acorn left on the ground. So, how does that impact the wild turkey? Well, that's very hard to quantify, because it's a factor of that hen's body condition coming out of the winter going into the nesting season, that's surely going to have some sort of impact on her ability to be successful. We don't really know what that is. And it's very, very hard to quantify. I'm not sure exactly how you would go about that. Mm-hmm. So take home message, yeah, feral hogs are bad, not just for turkeys, but a lot of wildlife.
So there's a follow-up question that I wanted to ask. Max talks about that he has hunted in the Atchafalaya Basin for 20 years. And up into the last 5 years, there have been he's had a pretty good run of it. The only thing that he can explain it is feral hogs. And so I'm wondering if there is another explanation you could give him on why there's been a decline of wild turkeys in that region.
Right. Well, yeah. Bret talked about it earlier about the Morganza Spillway affecting the Atchafalaya Basin back in 2011, and that didn't totally annihilate turkeys from the area, but it knocked a large percentage of the population out in places. They had to spend long periods of time in the trees. We actually had birds with GPS transmitters on them at the time. We had 5 birds out there. We lost 4 of them. Only had 1 survive. So it was 20 to 30 day flooding that they were having to stay up in the trees and survive. So it wasn't good for them. It was a stressful situation, but it didn't get them all. So what he's referring to is he may have been maybe on some of the higher ground within the basin and still had a small population of turkeys to hunt and pursue, which is great. But the problem is since 2011, and I can send you some graphs or some slides, we track our poult production survey facts, the poults people are seeing throughout the summer. We try to get an index on how good a hatch it's been, but we also have rainfall data that we enter off of the National Weather Center website. And when you look back at that rainfall data, so basically 5 out of the last 7 years have been above average rainfall in the month of April, May, and June, which is the most critical months for turkeys hatching. And the Atchafalaya Basin is some of our lowest habitat. It's already, some of our wettest habitat. So when you throw in above average rainfall and some of our low-lying areas that are subject to localized sheetwater flooding, and it doesn't even take sheetwater flooding. I mean, if poults are newly hatched and they get wet before they're fully feathered, they're going to catch hypothermia and die. So above average rainfall, big, large rain events, that blow through early in May and all the way through the month of May, those can be real concerning to poults hatching out. And like Bret said, we may hatch 30% of the nest, but of those 30%, only 5% raise a successful brood out of that, 1 poult out of that, So, I mean, it's a challenge out there for birds. So that's kind of what we've seen in the Atchafalaya Basin is above average. We've had this major flood event, this catastrophic event for a lot of wildlife, turkeys included, start the snowball, and then it just got piled on with above average, rainfall events. I mean, 2018 really was the only exception in the last 5 years where it was drier than normal in the basin. All other years it's been wetter than normal. I mean, and they've threatened to reopen the Morganza the last 3 years in a row now. So, I mean, and been just in days of doing that. So when you're getting that type of spring, it's going to be a challenge for wild turkeys in bottom and hardwood areas. I mean, I haven't only seen the declines in the Atchafalaya Basin. If you go further north up to Richard K. Yancey, WMA, which is on the very most northern end of the basin, up around what used to be called Three Rivers, where the Atchafalaya actually starts, we're seeing the same population declines there. And it's just due to the challenge of being successful in reproduction throughout wet periods, wet springs. And traditionally, those bottom and hardwood areas were the best in Louisiana in the late 90s and early 2000s. They had the best populations, but we were also in some of the biggest drought years that we've ever been in. And those areas were as dry as they've ever been in some cases. So it was favorable conditions for turkey reproduction.
So this brings up the issue of weather also brings up another question that somebody asked that I find interesting. They're specifically asking about the population of turkeys in Kisatchie, but if you could just comment broadly in Louisiana, maybe even in Texas, how the hurricane season has affected, if at all, the turkey populations, or if you even know that information as of now.
I'll tell you what, I'll lead off on this one and I'll let Cody follow up and clean up. Is that okay with you, Cody?
Yeah, that'd be great.
So we don't know now what the impact is. Here's what I can tell you. We didn't see any that we know of acute mortality. And when I say acute mortality, it means that a tree fell over on a turkey and killed it. And that does happen during hurricanes. We've been, Cody and I have had a long-term project that actually started 2014 out there and had data from a couple of years before that. That's been continuing at Kisatchie. And we didn't see acute mortality or like immediate mortality when some of these hurricanes come through. Where my professional concern is that I think we're going to see reproductive implications over the next couple of years in that region due to the damage to vegetation. And I won't put any words into Cody's mouth, but I would suspect that there's probably been some discussions on regulatory adjustments made in that area to hedge on the fact that, most of the time, whenever you have this much damage to the forest and there's less usable space, you're going to reduce the amount of productivity, and you kind of want to be cautious going forward for a couple of years until you kind of get a good handle on things. And Cody, I know you guys have been working with the Forest Service on some of that stuff, so I'll kind of turn it over to you right now.
Yeah, I mean, that's the major concern is how that habitat is going to transition to, habitat that once was favorable for turkeys and use space to becoming a very thick, dense understory. That transition is going to take place in the next 5-year period. And how is that going to impact turkey movements, turkey dispersal, from one area to another, which we all know is necessary, for genetic purposes, and then the overall reproductive effort. We saw some of this same information or some of the same impacts in Southeast Louisiana in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina hit the southeast part of our state. And then in response to that, we did get more conservative with the season and actually remove a week off the end of that season for 2 parishes. However, we had very little data to show that has actually had a measurable impact. Common sense wants to tell us that it's good to get a little bit conservative, but ultimately it's the habitat recovery that's going to dictate, the population response from turkeys down the road. So we were also under a little bit different season back then. Our season opened up earlier, which we feel wasn't necessarily the best scenario for breeding turkeys. So now we have a delayed season that opens up later to allow for more opportunity for breeding prior to us hunting and disturbing the birds. So right now we're thinking that we're going to see what happens over this next year or two and then reevaluate things if we do need to get more conservative with our seasons over there. It's definitely an option. But the big concern from what I've seen, I spent a lot of time over there doing some habitat assessments all throughout that area, is you have some areas of pine uplands that are damaged, especially on some of Kisatchie National Forest itself. But the biggest concern for me from a turkey standpoint is the damage you see in the hardwood bottoms, because that's what they're living in the wintertime. And that's usually how they move from one area to the next. And that's some of the better habitat for turkeys, especially, all up and around, and you get in some of those other landscapes out there. So
there have been a couple of questions or comments or people asking you to talk about certain subjects with regard to hunting, preservation, the kinds of efforts, the collaborations between hunters and wildlife managers to make our population sustainable, but also have a game for them to go after. And there's been some questions about how mature toms respond to hunting pressures and things like that. And so I'm just wondering if you could kind of talk about the relationship that you have with the hunting community and the impact that it has on the wild turkey populations?
I'll start with that one, Brett. I mean, we rely heavily on our hunters, not just our turkey hunters, but hunters of all species, to provide us the valuable data that we need to be able to make informed management decisions. You know, that's our primary means of collecting data, especially harvest data, when you can break it down by parish and time and throughout the season. And so we really need our hunters in that regard to provide us with accurate data on what they're harvesting, what they're seeing throughout the summer for our poult surveys and things like that. So yeah, they're an invaluable resource. And in the end, those are the folks, you know, we're trying to practice resource conservation to serve, you know, as a component of the public and provide opportunity for. So from my standpoint, they're invaluable.
Yeah, and I'll echo that, and I'll even take it one step further. I don't know the level of interest of the viewership, but the Pittman-Robertson Act is the foundation for wildlife conservation in the United States today. And effectively, what that means is that there's an excise tax. I think it's about 11%. That originally was on things like ammunition and firearms and hunting equipment. And that money is put into basically a bank account, the federal government. And then every year they distribute what's called PR dollars back to the states. And how those funds work is they're matched by money that the state raises through hunting license fees at 25% from the state, 75% from, you know, the taxes that hunters and fishermen. There's a Dingle Johnson Act for fishermen and whatnot. And those are the funds that actually are used for conservation and management by the state, Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. And those funds don't just affect game species. They also affect habitat management for non-game species, for threatened and endangered species, for ranging for things like boat docks and rocks on the road to, you know, the gas that goes into Cody's truck whenever he's going to go help us catch turkeys in the morning, to funding research to figure out, you know, what we can do to support the population. So hunters play a valuable role. But also it's, you know, wildlife enthusiasts and wildlife recreationists also play a role. And Cody alluded to this, and that those people, you know, they provide survey information, they count birds that they see, they turn in data on brood poult counts. I can't tell you how many pictures I get sent to me over Instagram and Facebook of turkey poults in somebody's backyard or out in their field or something, that just like seeing them. So it's a very it's a very synergistic relationship between, you know, both the hunting community and the outdoor recreationist community and the state agencies, both myself and Cody, and that we're all working together, focused on long-term sustainability. And I think that's, you know, really Cody and mine's focus is to push. And, you know, we're not thinking about what happens next year. He and I are thinking about what we need to do to ensure we have birds 20 years from now for recreational pursuits, whatever those recreational pursuits are.
So, Bret, you've kind of started to answer what I want to end with on a final question. No, this is great, and I'll throw it to Cody. Someone was asking, in a perfect world, what would it take to increase the turkey populations in the state? Do we need more trapping, more prescribed burning, more land conservation? What are the things that will make this that will help really sustain the turkey populations for generations to come, or is our population stable where we're really where we've been successful enough to say that we have a stable population, and now we just have to do the maintenance to make sure that it all continues. So, Cody, could you? Oh no,
there are definitely improvements to be made from the north end of the state to the south. And they all revolve around, you kind of alluded to it, habitat management for turkeys, specifically for turkeys, because, you know, when you're dealing with a state like ours where the vast majority of the land, the forest land, is privately owned, then it's a challenge. You know, private landowners have varying objectives that they find important and reasoning for doing the things they do on their property. And we as wildlife biologists and researchers, we need to do our best to influence that positively for turkey management. And in some cases we do make strides, but there's a lot more opportunity out there. If you took a look at our landscape, back 30 years ago, things were managed a lot differently. Our piney woods were consisted of bigger, larger trees. Our woods were more open, managed with prescribed fire. Typically, people ran cattle in the woods. That was a form of income for a lot of folks. And we've kind of gravitated away from that to more, a more industrial landscape. And it's a little bit less conducive to habitat management, not just for turkeys, but for other wildlife too. I mean, it's still beneficial, don't get me wrong, to have forest and not parking lot. But there are definitely some enhancements over the several next, it didn't take, our declines and declines in habitat quality didn't happen overnight, and it's not going to be reverted overnight. So it's kind of a slow and steady process. And in the time being, I consider our role, that's the state agency, to try to do what we can, try to influence some of the things we have influence on to help turkeys along that process, recognizing that the ultimate problem, with a lot of these populations are habitat related. Just like what I was talking about in the Atchafalaya Basin, there's not much we can do about the amount of rainfall and the flood impacts and the altered drainage systems that we deal with nowadays. I mean, we're not going to change things that were done 100 years ago for various reasons and try to favor turkey. So we got to take every opportunity we can to manage as much turkey habitat and try to influence as much of it in a positive way as we can. And that sometimes involves, making timber harvest recommendations. Sometimes it involves, recommending not to harvest quite so hard, and prescribed burning is a big part of that in the uplands. That's the one management practice across the Southeast that has declined, in popularity, and wildlife habitat has suffered for it.
Okay. Well, thank you, Cody, and thank you, Bret, so much for your contributions. What a great and engaging presentation. And thank you to our audience for wonderful questions that you presented. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to them all, but as you saw, Dr. Cedotal and Dr. Collier are very happy to talk at length about turkeys, turkey habitat, etc. So this was great. This was absolutely fabulous. And if you're enjoying our talk tonight, Dr. Collier will also be presenting a talk to children 12 and under as part of the Juice Box and Conservation series that's going to be live streamed on the National Wild Turkey Federation's Facebook page. We've put a link in the chat room, in the chat box for you if you'd like to go to that. Tonight's lucky winner of the WRKF drawing is Bob Strader from Natchez, Mississippi. Congratulations, Bob. WRKF will mail you the Science Friday beverage tumbler as soon as they can. This concludes our Science Cafe program for 2020, and it's our programming. It's the last program for the year. As you know, we'll take December off, and we'll be back in January on Tuesday, January 26th, for a Science Cafe talk with sociologist Dr. Ed Shahada, talking about smarter and safer, the science behind second chances. We hope you all have a safe and healthy holiday season. We wish you all the very best. Thank you all for attending. Good night. We'll see you next time.